we need a Home Secretary, like I said in my kind of opening remarks, that's fully committed to overcoming these obstacles, that's fully committed to driving through this reform that needs to be delivered on going into the next election, and that the public rightly expects the government to deliver on. And if Suella Braverman isn't the person to deliver that reform, if she's more determined to continue to just drive a wedge for the sake of her own leadership ambitions, and I think it's time that the Prime Minister moves her on and brings in someone who is fully committed and fully able to delivering upon that.
What do you make of Suella Braverman's, well, what she wrote in the Times, her tone, her comments in recent days?
I think that there's kind of multiple parts of that to unpack. Firstly, what she said in terms of her core message, I think I find it very hard to disagree with. I think there has been a troubling inconsistency when it comes to the way some of these issues have been policed, and I think that that is reflective of how many people have felt. I think that that is a separate issue to some of the article. I think some of the articles clearly designed to drive a wedge between her and the Prime Minister, potentially with the leadership in mind. And then there's another issue, which I think is the bigger one, and that is, as Home Secretary, it is her duty, if she feels, as so many of us do, that there is a genuine issue with law and order and how it's applied in the UK, then it is her duty to bring about the reforms to change that. And that isn't achieved by these public pronouncements expressing her indignation at these issues, because ultimately, as Home Secretary, she is the one with the resources at her disposal to bring about the change to fix these issues and leave the country in a better place when it comes to issues such as law and order. And I'd like to see her doing more to fix those problems.
Roger, isn't that a fair point, that actually as Home Secretary, she's got a lot of power, Suella Braverman, and she could actually make these changes. And in fact, as we were speaking before the news at 8 o'clock, we were speaking to Richard Hughes, who's from the Western Front Association, which is organising tomorrow's events at the Cenotaph. And he said, actually, these conversations should be happening in private with the police. It shouldn't be played out in public.
Well, I think what the Home Secretary is doing is helping to deliver on the promise that the Prime Minister made a few days ago of holding the Met to account for the decisions which they make operationally. Now, holding the police to account is explicitly in London the job of the Mayor of London and the Home Secretary. And therefore, the Prime Minister is dependent on Suella to help him do that. And what Suella is doing is she's not being critical of the police as a whole, or even the whole of the Met. What she is focusing on is the decisions which the leadership, the top people in the Metropolitan Police are making. In fact, the Home Secretary has always been very supportive of the individual police officers and the conditions under which they have to work. In fact, by focusing on the problems which are being caused by these marches taking place so frequently and being so widespread, she's very much speaking up in support.
But she's not, is she? She's not supporting the police. She's talking about soft touch policing. She was forced by Number 10 to take that out. She's talking about them playing favourites. She's not supporting the police. She's undermining them.
She's talking about the leadership of the police. It's like lions led by donkeys in the First World War. You have to draw a distinction between the handful of top people making bad decisions at the top versus the many thousands of people loyally working underneath them.
Do you fear that she's stoking divisions? I mean, when she's talking about pro-Palestinian mobs and hate marches, I mean, let's be realistic about the number of people who have been arrested after these protests compared to the sheer number of people, you know, the tens of thousands of people out on the streets and the handful of people who've been arrested for, you know, potentially illegal behaviour, chanting, whatever. You know, her comments have led to things like the leader of the English Defence League, Tommy Robinson, calling for people to come to London to protect the Cenotaph.
Well, in terms of the arrests, I'd certainly very much applaud the restraint which the police have shown in keeping law and order on the street under very difficult conditions. But I think in terms of division, it's clear that such divisions already exist in society. They're not created by any one person. And what Suella is doing is trying to establish the best way for the country and for the police to respond to those differences of opinion which exist. And simply having hundreds of thousands, perhaps 1 million people running around on the streets in London maybe is not the best way for different opinions to be debated.
Ethan, do you think that Rishi Sunak should sack Suella Braverman, if for no other reason than she is undermining his authority?
I think that it's going to inevitably reach a point where a decision has to be taken on it. I think that, as we've just heard, he's come close to it on multiple occasions. I think for me, we're a year out from an election. There is so much still that needs to be delivered on, particularly when it comes to the Home Office. Of course, one of the Prime Minister's 5 pledges is to stop the small boats. And with the verdict on the ECHR coming next week and the challenges that will provide and the obstacles that might provide, I think we need a Home Secretary, like I said in my kind of opening remarks, that's fully committed to overcoming these obstacles, that's fully committed to driving through this reform that needs to be delivered on going into the next election, and that the public rightly expects the government to deliver on. And if Suella Braverman isn't the person to deliver that reform, if she's more determined to continue to just drive a wedge for the sake of her own leadership ambitions, and I think it's time that the Prime Minister moves her on and brings in someone who is fully committed and fully able to delivering upon that.
And Roger, isn't that the problem? That actually, as Ethan says, a year out from an election, the government needs to be just whacking out policy and saying, this is what we're going to do, this is what's going to change. We had Robert Halfon on, the Skills Minister, after 7 o'clock this morning. He wanted to talk about a new policy. Obviously, all we wanted to talk to him about really was, although he did mention it, was about Suella Braverman's comments. Isn't she just distracting from what the government should be doing right now?
We've heard mentioned policies such as stopping the small boats and, of course, the imminent decision on Rwanda. Obviously, those initiatives came directly out of proposals which Suella had made. The Prime Minister is keen to deliver on stopping the small boats. It's essential to have people like Suella at his side who are dead keen on the policy at the start and who are doing everything they can to help implement it. So, on the contrary, I think that Suella delivering on the pledges which the Prime Minister made is essential. And I'd like to see that go on. And those policies are very much dear to Suella's heart. So getting rid of Suella would certainly not help to deliver on either of those.